Hi, I'm Mark Gatta, and I've been asked to put together a series of videos for you on how to be a graphic designer. I'm a graphic designer myself, but I've also got extensive experience of the print industry from the inside. I had my own print shop in the UK, and I was production manager for one of the largest printers in North California, where I lived for some time. I officially became self-employed freelance designer on January 1st, 1990, partly because it's an easy date to remember, and I've now been doing that for over 20 years. I still get stuff printed all over the place, and for the last few years I've been back in the UK, and as well as graphic design I've been teaching intensive 2- and 3-day courses covering the use of Adobe Graphics software, which I think is the best in the world. I'm what's known as an Adobe Ace. That's Adobe Certified Expert in Photoshop, InDesign, and also in Illustrator. And I'm also what's known as an ACI, that's Adobe Certified Instructor. Most of the people who attend my courses are already graphics professionals who want to improve their skills, and I do my best to figure out what they need. So, hopefully, you're going to find these videos at least interesting, and I hope that they'll also be helpful. Graphics is a lot of fun, as well as being stressful, tough, and competitive, but as with anything else worth learning, there are tips and tricks that will make the road easier, and you're going to find some of them here. So, let's get started. First, my intention in these videos is not only to help you become a designer, but to tell you very sincerely that you already are. You're quite probably a world-class artist if you did but know it. And as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter whether you think you have any skills at all, or you quietly consider yourself to be quite skilled, and you're watching these videos just to fine-tune your approach a little. As far as art goes, I think we're all created equal. We're all artists, and we're all capable of creating great art. Now, of course, you may disagree. And in doing so, you would certainly not be the first. I've had this conversation many times, and I've heard all the excuses, including the one I consider the classic, "Oh, I can't even draw a straight line." Well, nor can I. I think that was just plain silly. Anyone, and of course there I'm including artists, who really wants to draw a straight line will probably use one of these, or some other straight edge. You'd have to be nuts not to. If you relied on doing it freehand, it's not going to work. And if you go to any of the great galleries, you'll find amazing paintings that include straight edges, and you can bet that the artist used something like this to draw them. But how about if I said to you, okay, let's draw a horse? It's kind of different, isn't it? There's not very many straight lines on a horse. I definitely agree that you cannot draw a horse with a ruler. Nevertheless, I think we're all capable of drawing a really good horse. But I think for most of us, there's one thing getting in the way, and that's the stuff we put in the way. Now let me give you an example. Here's my signature. It's nothing special. In fact, I can do it without thinking, which is really the point. Most of us can sign our name without thinking. It's just something we do. And so for all of us, it's no big deal. But our signature is unique. In fact, it's so unique, it's our recognized, legally binding official seal of approval. If someone uses our signature without our permission, they've broken the law. It's what we use for important documents. So our signature is regarded as really, really important. But why? What makes it so special? I think it's because it's pure self-expression. It's 100% us. And when we do it, we don't let anything get in the way. And every time we do it, it's similar to all the other times we do it, even though none of them are exactly the same. All these are different. But it's recognizable. You can look at someone's signature and say, "Yep, that's Charlie," or whoever. Signatures by famous people, autographs, can be very valuable. It's like they're an extension of the person somehow. So our signature is considered to be a kind of true reflection of us. But it's not exactly rare, is it? Signing our name's something universal. Pretty much all of us can do it. It doesn't depend on wealth or popularity or social position. It just depends on the physical ability, knowing how to do it, a piece of paper, and a pen. Now, while it's probably impossible to define exactly what constitutes art, many of us would probably agree that a big part of it is pure self-expression, just the same as your signature. So I think it proves that you can do it too. All you've got to do is clear the deck a little and release your natural abilities, and yes, I do think they're natural. I think we're born with this. And in the next video, I'll show you what I mean. Prehistoric cave paintings are generally considered as great art of enormous historical importance. Much of it consists of amazing, deceptively simple drawings of animals. They're so lifelike. I mean, look at this horse. They seem to capture the essence of the real thing. They're filled with life and movement. And this is the key thing, they were done without any training at all. If those guys had had to practice painting, we would have cave after cave filled with their practice efforts, but all we've got is the good stuff. It's all good stuff. Well, almost all good stuff. It's as if the artist just walked over to the cave walls with the ochre or the soot or whatever it was they were using as pigment, and they just started in, and nothing got in the way. Mostly. In fact, it's possible that some of the paintings aren't quite as good as others. Although this, of course, depends on your opinion. Now, maybe some of them weren't quite as gifted as others, or they were younger, or they were trying their hand at being grown up, or whatever. I don't know. Or they perhaps should have really practiced a bit more. Whatever the reason, there had to be a reason. I find this one kind of reassuring. My theory is that the reason those guys could just walk over to the cave wall and start painting without any training is because in many ways their lives were less complex than our own and much more focused. Physically, we're identical. There are no differences between us and them at all. So perhaps part of their amazing artistic ability came from this comparatively uncomplicated lifestyle. Because whatever the reason, nothing got in the way of them painting. Now, their lives may have been complicated in ways we can't even imagine, but they didn't have to worry about taxes, vacations, school fees, retirement plans, health insurance, all these other things that we, with our distracted and so-called sophisticated lives, have to deal with. Probably if we could reduce our own lives to the same degree of simplicity as theirs, we'd be able to draw horses and antelope just as well as they did. But instead, sophisticated, for want of a better word, is what we have become. And gradually our living spaces have evolved as our sophistication increased. And as this happened, our artistic ability became more and more restricted within society. Eventually, it became the provenance of a much smaller group of people, the artists. Because their ability was no longer in the domain of the everyday, the skills became more and more highly prized. Anyway, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let's back up and head for Italy, because that's where the history of our art really began to accelerate. Let's go to Florence. The Renaissance began sometime in the 1200s and lasted for several hundred years, and it was a flowering of a great many good things, including painting, sculpture, and architecture. And it was centered in Florence. Just about all the famous artists of the day lived there. Well, some lived in Venice and one or two in Milan and Padua, but almost all of them either lived in Florence or worked there for some part of their life. And everyday life had become pretty complex by then, complex enough for things to be getting in the way. So artists had become very highly regarded members of society. Even so, I think the days of not needing training were over. Only by undergoing an apprenticeship of several years could an artist develop their skills to the point where they could produce art on demand. And as with all skills, this required continual practice. Without it, the distractions of daily life could easily overcome artistic ability just by putting stuff in the way. Anyway, back in 1302 or 1303, there was an artist called Giotto. He was one of the main artists of the day. And at the same time, over in the Vatican, the Pope was Benedict XI. He wanted to commission some frescoes for one of his palaces. Now, popes were very powerful and very wealthy, and he didn't just have the Vatican to live in. He had other palaces as well. This one was in Avignon in France. And being the Pope, he only wanted the best artist for his frescoes. Of course. So to find out who should get the job, he sent one of his courtiers out to all the famous and well-known artists of the day to request a sample of their work. Eventually the courtier arrived in Florence, and shortly after that he arrived at Giotto's studio. But Giotto was a very busy man. He's a good artist. And what he basically said was, I don't have time for this. And he picked up a big sheet of parchment and a brush loaded with red paint, and he drew a big circle. But not just any circle. He drew a perfect circle. The courtier didn't get it. He thought he was being insulted at first, and he almost didn't take it. But in the end he did. And of course when the Pope saw it, he recognized that only a genius could have done something like that. And Giotto got the job. Giotto is what's known as a Renaissance man as well as being a Renaissance artist. And that means that he was multi-talented. He didn't just paint, he was also, among other talents, a really good architect. Here's one of his buildings. This is the campanile, or the bell tower, of the Duomo. And the Duomo is the main cathedral in Florence, and it's well worth a visit. There's some dispute as to where Giotto was actually born. Most experts today lean towards Florence, despite the fact that there's a plaque to the contrary in the small village of Colle Vespignano. It's been doing very well for some time on the idea that Giotto was born there instead. This is quite possibly a portrait of Giotto. It's a detail of the decorations in the Peruzzi Chapel, in Florence, of course. He was apparently so clever with a brush that as a boy, one day when his master was away from the workshop, Giotto painted a fly on the painting his master was working on, and it was so realistic that when he came back he tried to brush it away several times before he realized it wasn't real. Now again, exactly to whom he was apprenticed is also subject to dispute. Similarly, he may or may not have painted the frescoes known as the Francis cycle in the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. He definitely married, but it's not known for sure how many children he had. It could have been as many as 8, all of whom apparently were of plain appearance. That's a description from the time. And even where he's buried isn't quite certain. There are at least 2 possibilities. And he may or may not have been extremely ugly and only slightly over 4 feet tall. Vasari, Giorgio Vasari, who was a well-known Renaissance painter, also an architect and a writer, said that there was no uglier man in the city of Florence. Vasari, incidentally, wrote one of the biographies of Michelangelo, who we'll be meeting soon, as well as a very well-known book called The Lives of the Great Artists. Now this is one of our main sources of information about the Renaissance, which was a word he was the first person to use in print in describing that entire period. We know that some of his stories were invented. Probably the story about Giotto and the fly was invented, but in general he's thought to have been telling the truth. Dante, of Dante's Inferno fame, knew Giotto, and he once asked him how somebody who painted such beautiful pictures could have fathered such nondescript children. "I made them in the dark," Giotto is said to have replied. Regardless of our many uncertainties about him, Giotto did very well. He received many requests for commissions, and he left behind a large body of work that can definitely be attributed to him, as well as lots of others that can't. Here's some more of his paintings, just to give you an idea of the ways in which the art world was developing at the time. This is known as the Ognissanti Madonna. It's now in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And this is the Kiss of Judas in the Arena Chapel in Padova. And also in the Arena Chapel, the Flight into Egypt. Now you can see the blue color at the back of this fresco looks as if it's in pretty bad shape, whereas the rest of it looks great. Now fresco is a watercolor painting process applied to the wall plaster while it's still wet. You got to work fast to do frescoes. However, the only two sources for blue back then were ground up lapis lazuli and another mineral called azurite, and they didn't work well as frescoes. They were usually added secco, that is, when the plaster was dry. This is not an ideal match. The secco process works best with slightly rough plaster, while fresco works best when the plaster is damp and smooth. So sometimes the blue flakes off. Now today these paintings may seem somewhat old and strange, but back then they represented a way of painting that was completely new, and nobody had ever seen anything like it. That's why they're so important. I mean, imagine for a moment the only paintings you'd ever seen were from ancient Rome, such as this mural from Pompeii, or this fresco from a private villa dating from 43 to 30 BC. Now, there's nothing wrong with these, and I'm sure they made great wall decorations. Or how about this image from ancient Egypt? This cheery and typically two-dimensional depiction of one of the pharaohs, Saremput II, is, while very colorful, a tomb painting. Some of the best and most beautiful of Egyptian art was intended to be hidden away in secret, never to be seen again by mortal eyes. Incidentally, in Egyptian art, important people were always shown as being much bigger than ordinary people, which is why the figure of Saremput on the left is so much bigger than anyone else. It's not that he was a giant. It's just to emphasize how important he was compared to the rest of us. And here's another. Now this is a page from the famous Book of the Dead, and this was made as part of the funeral arrangements for a scribe called Nebkad during the reign of Amenhotep III, and that puts it around 1391 to 1353 BC, which is when he reigned. The Egyptians created stunning and massively impressive architecture and some amazingly beautiful and expressive sculptures, but their paintings, although they're utterly lovely and instantly recognizable, were always dead flat, with no linear perspective whatsoever. The Romans figured perspective out to some degree, but they didn't really embrace it as being something especially important. So while it's sometimes present, you sometimes get a hint of it, it's no big deal, and it was often seriously distorted. So if you're suddenly confronted by a picture in which linear perspective has not only been built in, but was the main construction guideline governing the layout of the whole painting, you'd be absolutely stunned. The Renaissance artists managed to get the other stuff out of the way to the point where they could paint, sculpt, and build in a manner which had not only never been seen before, it engaged the viewer in a completely new way. It took hold of their minds, and they couldn't help becoming involved. In exactly the same way, designers today try to find ways to affect people and get them involved by engaging with their minds. But this was the first time it had ever been done. And that's why the Renaissance is so important to the world of the graphic designer. But in order to become artists or designers, architects, whatever you want to be in the art world, the first thing you've got to do is get the unwanted stuff out of the way. And then we, too, can be artists. For most of us, it's impossible. The only time we achieve it is when we don't even realize we're achieving it, when we sign our name. But if we train ourselves, we can stop letting stuff get in the way other times as well. The biggest thing we have to avoid, the thing that gets in the way of self-expression the most, is self-consciousness. Now, when we say we're feeling self-conscious, you could say it really means we're feeling other-conscious. We're filled with the thoughts of how others are going to view what we're doing. We have to get beyond that. And if you can get to the point at which you're no longer worried about what others will think, you'll be able to express yourself without being blocked by other stuff. And you might even find you can draw a horse. Over the next few videos, I'm going to talk a little about some of the main early Renaissance artists to give you an idea of their lives and their important work. Because, and I'll probably keep saying this, you can't understand art and design today unless you understand something about the Renaissance. Almost all the art we have today is standing on the shoulders of the Renaissance giants in one way or another. I'll also talk some about some of the patrons, particularly the Medici family, as you can't have great art without rich patrons. Somebody has to pay for the artist to paint, sculpt, or build, because it's difficult, and is maybe more difficult now than it was then, for artists to feed and clothe themselves while they concentrate on producing art. The other great patron of the time was the Catholic Church, which of course had its headquarters in the Vatican in Rome. And that's why so much of the art created back then depicts scenes from the Bible, and also why so much of it is found in churches. The artists painted the altarpieces, the ceilings, the walls, they carved the beautiful sculptures, and they even designed and built the buildings themselves. So the great churches of the Renaissance are solid art from top to bottom. The Medici family, however, were not the church itself, even though their contribution to it was immense. 4 popes and several cardinals were sons of the Medicis. They were a family based on money rather than religion, and they became powerful through the family business of banking. And they were clever, too. The Medici were among the first to use the double-entry accounting system invented by the Franciscan friar Luca Pacioli, who also just happened to teach mathematics to Leonardo da Vinci. Other Medicis married into royal families elsewhere, notably in France. It's interesting to note that while lots of other countries at the time had their own royal family, complete with kings and queens, the Italians did not. Instead, Italy was divided into areas. Tuscany, for example, in the north, had within it towns such as Florence and Siena. Each had strong ruling families that were not actually royalty. Aristocracy, sure. So they were dukes and so on, but they weren't kings and queens. The closest the Italians came to royalty back then was the House of Savoy, first in the county and then the duchy of that name, which eventually did produce kings of a unified Italy. But that didn't happen until 1861. This is the Savoy coat of arms, by the way. So the main patrons were the church and the Medici. And because the Medici wasn't the church, and the church wasn't the Medici, they patronized different things. Popes and cardinals were much more likely to sponsor religious paintings and sculpture, and perhaps their own tombs, such as this. This is the tomb of Julius II. It was often planned long before they were actually required, so that the intended inhabitant could be satisfied that they were grand and important enough to house their remains. Now this tomb, which is built by Michelangelo, he spent 6 months just picking out the marble for it. He fell out with Julius partway through and returned to Florence, and Julius actually threatened to wage war on the Florentines unless he came back to Rome to continue the work. Now, vast and impressive though this is, in fact it's much reduced as the project was drastically scaled down when the Pope died. And it was even built in a completely different church. Originally it was intended to be 3 stories tall, with at least 40 statues, and in St. Peter's Basilica, and it was finally put together in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli, where Julius had been a cardinal before becoming Pope. All in all, it was a huge disappointment for Michelangelo. Nevertheless, its central figure of Moses has become famous worldwide, so not all was lost. And you've got to say, it's still a very impressive tomb. The Medici patronized a great deal of religious work, possibly because religion was so important to everyone back then, and art had a history of portraying things religious. So it was almost expected that the subject of art should be religious themes. But they also managed to sponsor portraits, palaces, and a lot of much more secular work, and tombs. The mausoleum of the Medici is quite amazing, and to our eyes today, perhaps slightly overdone. It's in this building, the Medici Chapel of the Basilica San Lorenzo, and it contains work by Bronzino, Donatello, Michelangelo, Fra Filippo Lippi, and many more. And it also contains the tombs of no less than 15 rulers of the Medici family, many of whom were dukes. So of course there was a big area of overlap. Aside from the religious nature of many works commissioned by the Medicis, there were also, like Pope Julius II and others, very sensitive to how people would remember them after their death. And what better way to impress than by having incredibly ornate tombs constructed in an even more ornate interior by the leading artists of the day. This is Lorenzo Ghiberti. He's one of the early greats of the Renaissance and was born in 1378, a few miles outside Florence, and he's most well known for the amazing bronze doors that he made for the baptistry of the Duomo. This is the baptistry. The doors were made for 2 separate commissions, the first of which he won in a competition when he was only 23, beating someone who'd previously been an apprentice with him, Brunelleschi, who went on to design and build the dome of the main cathedral itself. The workshop he set up to produce the doors provided training for a lot of other artists, including Donatello, who we'll be meeting soon. Now once the first set of 28 panels was complete, which took 21 years, he was immediately commissioned to produce a second set for another doorway. And it was this set that Michelangelo called the Gates of Paradise. These took 27 years. So it's not surprising that it's for these that he's so well known. They took him most of his life. Can you imagine anyone today ordering work that would take 21 years or 27 years? He didn't produce all the doors of the baptistry. Another artist, Andrea Pisano, was recommended by Giotto, who he succeeded as the sculptor for the cathedral. And he created the doors now on the south side of the building. They were originally on the east side, but they were moved to their present position in 1452, and Ghiberti added the relief work in the door case around the same time. There were 4 finalists in the original doors competition. 2 of them were knocked out, leaving just Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, and the judges couldn't decide between them. So they asked them to work together. However, this was more than Brunelleschi's pride could tolerate, and he left Florence and went to work in Rome instead. This is Ghiberti's winning design. It's created for the panel called the Sacrifice of Isaac, which eventually became part of the second commission. It's now in the Bargello Museum in Florence, together with Brunelleschi's entry. One of the great innovations of Ghiberti's work, and one of the reasons it was so immediately famous, was perspective. Another artist of the Renaissance, Paolo Uccello, is commonly regarded as the first great master of perspective. He worked with Ghiberti for several years, making it more difficult to separate his own ideas from Ghiberti's. Donatello also worked in Ghiberti's workshop for a short while, and he's famous for what's known as central point perspective in sculpture. And Brunelleschi, already mentioned, developed and used the geometrical perspective, which is still in universal use today, the vanishing point. So between them, these four individuals, who were all contemporaries, laid the basis of perspective methods which have been used ever since. However, and in the tradition of standing on the shoulders of giants, I should mention that Ghiberti, who also wrote what's possibly the first autobiography of an artist, was himself influenced by the Arabic writer Alhazen, who composed his Book of Optics in the early 11th century, and which dealt with the optical basis of perspective. So, as I've said many times, it's all been done before, even when it's new. Donatello, whose full name was Donato di Niccolo di Bettobardi, so you can see why I changed it, was born in around 1386. He was one of the best known of the early Renaissance sculptors, and, as I've mentioned in the previous video, he worked with Ghiberti and was in part responsible for the laws of perspective which govern the way we think art should look today. So he's incredibly important for that reason alone. However, there's more than perspective to Donatello. He also created the first life-size statue of somebody sitting on a horse that had been made since the days of ancient Rome. This is the Gattamelata, and it depicts Erasmo di Narni on his horse. It was commissioned by Erasmo's heirs in the year of his death and placed in the square opposite the new Basilica of St. Anthony. You can see it here on the right, on the pedestal. Between 1404 and 1407, he worked with Brunelleschi in Rome, digging up treasure, basically, well, trying to. Officially, they were engaged in study and excavations, and he had to earn his living working in goldsmith shops, so I guess the treasure was in short supply. While they were there, Brunelleschi measured many ancient Roman buildings, including the Dome of the Pantheon, invaluable for his future work as the architect of the Duomo Dome, and Donatello refined his abilities as a sculptor. Between them, these two and their respective specialities would be a strong influence on other Renaissance artists, and therefore of artists today. Donatello completed many works for the church, but is probably remembered most for this statue of David, commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici. It's not a particularly large statue, but it was particularly impressive at the time because it was the first ever freestanding nude produced since, once again, the artists of ancient Greece and Rome. So Donatello was yet again standing on the shoulders of giants, and yet again he was giving the world a taste of something which appeared to be new, and which in many ways was. This is Giovanni Bellini, and he was born in Venice, not Florence, in 1430. He was the most famous of a family of famous artists, and is credited with revolutionizing Venetian painting. His style strongly influenced his students, especially Titian, very famous in his own right, who later challenged him for equal responsibility. The actual title was Master in Charge of the paintings in the Hall of the Great Council, which was a position Bellini had previously held for some time. Bellini pioneered the use of oil paint and experimented with natural landscapes and color and atmosphere in ways never seen before. So on top of the new understanding of perspective we have from Donatello and Brunelleschi and Ghiberti and so on, we can now add to it the subtle coloring, beautiful landscapes, and atmospheres of Bellini. What an incredible time for an artist to have been alive. Now I'm concentrating here on the major artists who've been around at the time of Michelangelo, who we'll be meeting later. To me, one of the most incredible things about the Renaissance is how many world-class artists were in Florence or nearby in Venice over a period of just a couple of hundred years. Most of them could easily go and talk to other living legends of the time just by walking across town, or less. Sandro Botticelli, for example. Botticelli painted beautiful people, and he was one of the artists summoned by Pope Sixtus IV to paint frescoes on the walls of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. Michelangelo, of course, painted the ceiling and also the huge altar wall, despite thinking that painting was a low art compared to sculpture. Botticelli gave us such wonderful paintings as The Birth of Venus, also known as Venus on the Half Shell, for whom the model was Simonetta Cattaneo Vespucci, renowned as the greatest beauty of her age, and certainly of Florence. Botticelli had something of an infatuation with her, as did just about every other nobleman in Florence, including two of the ruling Medici. She died, to the dismay of the entire city, at the age of 22, probably from pulmonary tuberculosis. Thousands followed her coffin to its burial. Her husband was a distant cousin of Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine explorer and cartographer after whom both North and South America were named. Botticelli expressed his desire to be buried at her feet, and his wishes were eventually fulfilled when he died in 1510. Now I'm going to cover one more artist before we leave the Renaissance behind for a while. We've already met Brunelleschi. Here he is again, and the sculpture shows him seated, gazing up at the dome which made him famous, the dome of the Duomo, the central cathedral in Florence. It was an especially huge undertaking back then, and no one had any idea how to create it. They'd built the building, but they didn't have a dome. I guess they just figured when the time came, they'd figure it out. But this dome would be bigger than anything built since the time of the Romans. Brunelleschi spent several years in Rome in the company of Donatello, measuring and examining at his leisure some of the oldest surviving buildings, including the Pantheon and the baths of Diocletian. He'd also read and absorbed De Architectura, a book by the first-century engineer Vitruvius, in which he described the mechanisms used by the Romans to construct buildings like this. So he was very well placed to win the architectural competition posed by the elders of the city of Florence. The story is that they asked all the competitors to stand an egg upright on a slab of marble, and of course the eggs just rolled around. Brunelleschi tapped his into place, breaking the shell at the end, so it stood upright. The other architects protested that they could have done just the same thing, to which he laughingly replied that they could also have built the dome had they but seen his design. And he got the job. It's probably just as well, because his main rival for the work was Ghiberti, who'd been previously awarded, with Brunelleschi, the commission for the doors of the baptistry. That rivalry had caused Brunelleschi to leave Florence for Rome rather than work alongside. Had he not been chosen for the dome, he probably would have gone for good. There were several problems. First, buttresses were out. They'd been forbidden by the city fathers. Second, rafters long and strong enough to cross this void didn't exist. Third, the mortar they used back then took several days to dry, and it would leave the strain of supporting the build on the mortar and on the scaffolding for a very long time. The risk was that it would all collapse under its own weight. The entire job, from its inception in 1418 to its completion in 1445, took much of Brunelleschi's life. He died in 1446. He devised some ingenious ways to ensure the work continued at what he considered to be a good pace. Workers were not allowed to leave during their breaks, and food and wine was sent up to them where they worked. He felt, wisely enough that if the workers had to walk up and down all the stairs to and from, they'd become exhausted and productivity would drop. The wine he supplied was diluted, as it was for pregnant women at the time. He issued a patent for one of his inventions, a hoist, to try to prevent the theft of his ideas, and he was later granted the first modern patent for a transport ship. Eventually the dome was complete, and of course it didn't collapse. It's still there for us today. Another architectural masterpiece from Brunelleschi was the Pazzi Chapel, also in Florence. Sometimes humanity has managed to create something that's immediately, or almost immediately, regarded as a classic. That designation tends to be applied to things which attract a very high popularity level really quickly, and maybe so high that it seems permanent. It's like it's never going to go away because the thing is just so good. And sometimes its sheer size helps. For instance, while historically we're a pretty destructive bunch, in Europe especially, you can still find cathedrals and palaces dating back hundreds of years. They're classics. They're not just hard to beat, they're impossible to beat. They'd be impossible to replace as well. Although how they look now and how they looked when they originally built is often two very different things. But they have an appearance of permanence, of solidity, and it's mere illusion. Everything crumbles to dust eventually. Just look at the ruins left behind by the ancient Egyptians. They certainly built things to last, and they probably thought they'd still be around today to enjoy them. But all we have left is either ruined buildings or displays in museums, which is kind of sad. And the same's true of civilizations like that of the Incas. Here's Machu Picchu, which is an entire city. And their walls were so sophisticated that we couldn't reproduce them today even if we had to. All the ancient civilizations thought they'd be around forever, just the same as we do. And no doubt we'll be proved wrong one day as well. So the best we can hope for is that our work is going to be around for a while. We just don't know how long. So forget immortality. It's not going to happen. All over the world you can go to museums and see sculptures and paintings, jewelry, and all kinds of things that are not only considered classics, they're also said to be priceless. Now that's a bit of a non-qualification. It doesn't mean that it could never be purchased even with all the money in the world. It just means that nobody really knows how to put a price on it. But if you put something, anything, up for auction, you'll soon find out what it's worth, on that day and to the audience you sell it to. On another day, with a different audience, it may command a totally different price, so that's not fixed either, and that's how it always works. Designers draw their inspiration from things that appeal to them. Of course, we all do this. Our likes and dislikes are based on our perceptions of the world around us and our interaction with it. And as we're all members of the same species, small wonder that sometimes vast numbers of us decide to like the same thing, like chocolate, for example, or buying clothes, fashion, or music. But the length of time we'll hold on to something under our like heading depends on a lot of factors. Some are more transitory than others. Clothing fashions are a good example. Some styles are hugely popular for a while and then they're gone, sometimes forever. Do you ever think those huge lacy Elizabethan ruffs will come back in? To say nothing of the other stuff they wore? Can you imagine going out looking like this today? Or how about the Victorian bustle? I guess they might come back one day, but they haven't yet. But they could. All it would take is yet another change in fashion styles, and they happen all the time. And after a while, they all tend to look kind of silly. And just because something hasn't come back doesn't mean it won't. Many clothing fashions have suddenly appeared, had their 15 minutes of fame, and then faded away only to return again in a slightly different form. Fashions from the 1940s and 50s have since ridden a huge popularity wave as retro styles, and now they can change hands for far more than they cost originally. And then there are styles which just defy classification. How about the miniskirt? It arrived to huge fanfare and acclaim in the 1960s, and it's never really gone away since. But while we may think of it as having started in the 60s, if you go back a bit further, you'll find them in the 1920s, and even before. And the ancient Romans not only had the miniskirt, here's a mosaic which proves they had the bikini as well. So something to be aware of in the world of design is that any design, whether it's fashion or the appearance of a page or a poster, whatever, it's likely to be at least similar to something that's been done before. Now, in the world of how things look, there's very little that is really, truly new. And while the individual approach may be unique, otherwise, of course, we wouldn't have famous artists, the ideas on which a new look is based have a wider appeal that enables them to reach out to huge numbers of people, and it's often been done before in some way. Cubism, for example, didn't just come from nowhere. And Impressionism, the same. And the Renaissance movement. Or the Victorian use of type, where every line on a poster was given a different typeface. These are all ideas that took a while to catch on, and then they spread like grass fire. Someone had the idea to begin with, based on something, and a bunch of others decided it was an interesting look and they wanted to try it as well, and that was followed by rapidly growing interest in the public eye, and suddenly the idea goes viral. Today, communication is easy, and it's becoming easier and easier, so ideas can spread in the blink of an eye. And you'd think that with all the competition this generates, these days you'd have to be really exceptionally good to rise to the top. But it's not necessarily the case. If you take a look around, then especially in the world of art, you're going to run into work that you flat out don't understand. Nevertheless, what you don't understand might be something that commands an incredibly high price, even if it's something you can't imagine paying money for, and it still makes its creator rich and famous. There's nothing intrinsically special about it. There's nothing inherent in it that makes the work valuable. All that's happening is enough people say it's good enough right now to create a demand, and that makes the price go up, whatever it is. Now that success might last for centuries, or it may be over and finished next week. The bottom line is, it's just based on opinion, and that's really what decides what's good or bad. Ease of communication is key to any idea being able to spread, and it has both advantages and disadvantages. For instance, take the camera. When it first appeared, hardly anybody had one or even knew how to use one. But cameras quickly became widespread and very popular indeed. But only professionals used them because, up until fairly recently, film and equipment was very expensive and there was a lot of technical stuff to learn. Those two factors stopped almost everybody else from getting in on the act. But if you take those two factors away by introducing cheap digital cameras, suddenly the field's wide open. Anyone can be a photographer, and everyone's got a good camera. Now, if you put that good camera into a mobile phone, suddenly it's not only all been done before, it's being done every day, all over again, by countless numbers of people all over the world. And suddenly it begins to look like everyone's a photographer. And if that feels a bit depressing, check up, because it's not really how it is. And don't forget, you've still got your signature, which is unique, and as far as I'm concerned, it proves that you're an artist. There are still people who are professional photographers, even though we've all got a camera that would have made the early photographers weep with envy. So it can still be done. So the way the world of the designer works is basically like this. First of all, somebody comes up with a product. And it could be a book or a movie or a new toothpaste. Products are often, but not always, created to fill a gap in the market. And that, in turn, can help identify the audience. Now, once the audience have been accurately identified, then the vehicle by which the product is going to be marketed to the audience, printed advertising, TV, online ads, billboards, whatever, can be determined. And at that point, the designer is brought in to do the creative work. And the hope is that enough people will like the results so much they'll be persuaded to buy whatever it is that's being sold. Now, people like Da Vinci and Mozart and Fabergé are just a few of the famous names we're probably all familiar with, and between them, they've left behind such amazing stuff that many of us feel their work helps define what's special about the human species. But where's the line between the great art and the everyday? That's a very tricky question, and it may not be really important to try and figure it out exactly. Maybe what's important is to accept that we like some things and we dislike others, and to recognize that our preferences between them are subject to constant change. So how we feel about something today may not be how we feel about it tomorrow. That's how it's always been. That's how it works today. Sometimes we all agree that something's special enough to put in a museum, and sometimes it gets put into a shop instead, and sometimes we just sling it straight into the trash. And sometimes the work of a good designer elevates an apparently ordinary, everyday object, a car for example, into something else, like Rolls-Royce. It's just a car, but to most of us we'd say, well, it's much more. Sure, it's got a certain reputation. It's handmade, there's attention to detail, the finest materials, but it goes beyond that. It's a concept, isn't it? Rolls-Royce sums up luxury, freedom, wealth, leisure, refinement. But are all those ideas, the things that the words Rolls-Royce conjures up in our minds, really out there sitting on those four wheels? Or are they just something that we believe in so much that we've come to accept they're true? So effective design creates an illusion. It kind of plants a seed. And the seed develops into an idea, and it's an idea about something that we think we might like. Now, it may not be cucumbers, and you do not need to write to me and say, those aren't cucumber seeds. I know they're not. I've written 2 books about gardening, specifically about growing vegetables, so I know what a cucumber seed looks like. The point here is that psychology has got a lot to do with how we react to stuff. For example, we respond very differently to a bright red than we do to a pale blue. But why? When you next go to the supermarket, check up and see what the colors are on the advertising banners in the main aisle, if you can't think of them right now, because they're not accidental and they're designed to make you do certain things, like buy stuff. Do you happen to know if these are the right colors or not? Check up next time you're there. Other things attract our attention for reasons we don't analyze at the time. For example, you know that spinning icon you see when you click on a movie and it doesn't start playing immediately? What do you think would happen if that didn't appear? Pretty quickly, you'd think nothing's happening and you'd click and go somewhere else. So that spinning thing's really saying, stick around, we're just getting the movie ready for you. Did you ever take your clothes to a laundromat and forget to take a book? And suddenly you realize that for the last 10 minutes you've been sitting there just watching your clothes going round and round. That spinning icon is just like our laundry. It's nothing special, but we can just sit and watch it with very little mental activity going on at the same time. We kind of get lost in it. The same's true down at the ocean. If you go down to the beach on a nice day, there'll be a lot of people doing just this. They're sitting there, gazing out at the ocean, which isn't doing very much. Waves come, waves go, maybe there's a ship or two, but the thing is the ocean is constantly moving. We're just watching its evolution from one moment to the next. The same is true of an open fire. We can all just sit and stare into a fire for ages, watching this really slow evolution. There's nothing really happening. It's just the fire burning. It's just the fire burning, but we get totally absorbed. And good designers know about these and many other psychological tricks, and you can find them in advertising all over the world. Sometimes they're considered kind of unfair, such as in subliminal advertising, which is now banned, supposedly. I'll get onto those a lot more in the videos dealing with ads. So the designer's got to build a bridge between the product and the audience. That being the case, what kind of tools are going to help? Some people think that all that's required for good design is having a flair for it. Now that helps, there's no doubt about it, in the same way that some people are naturally good at drawing or playing the piano or swimming or anything. But if you accept my original premise that anyone can become a reasonably good designer at least, then some background knowledge is also going to help. And these videos are intended to give you that background knowledge. So the first thing we're going to look at is the art and science of color. Hopefully some of my examples will land in the new, exciting, and different category for you. None of the colors will be new, of course, but my guess is you'll still find a few new ideas in the way they're presented, and also things to avoid. Now, good knowledge of typography is really helpful. Otherwise, given the huge number of fonts available today, how do you decide what's the right one? So we'll take a look at some of the history of type and some examples of ways in which typefaces can be grouped together. After that, we'll take a close look at the principles and elements of graphic design, because traditionally, a design combines just those two factors. The principles define the overall presentation of an idea, and the elements are the things that you actually put on the page or the screen. But we don't just thump things down onto a blank sheet of paper and hope for the best. There are methods which help, and some of the best of these, which are being used today even though they were thought of a very long time ago, will enable you to come up with something that people really like. Now, I really enjoy designing book covers because it's almost like doing a painting, and I love painting. They give the designer a wide, creative role that can be a load of fun. The book pages themselves require a whole different approach and a different set of rules and understanding. And of course, the two then have to work together. Ads and logos, in contrast to book covers, usually need a very clear focus. After all, they need to deliver their message without the help of a book. So again, they need a different approach. And finally, we'll take a look at the most fundamental kind of advertising a graphic designer is ever likely to need: marketing yourself. How can you expect a client to take you on board to market their products if you can't market yourself? Fair enough. So, that wraps up this introduction. Now let's take a closer look at color.